The Geoduck didn't lie. That was the thing about bivalves. They grew at exactly the rate the water allowed. Not faster, not slower. The shell recorded every season with the precision of something that had no reason to misrepresent itself and no capacity to do so. If the water had been good, the shell was heavy. If the water had been difficult, the shell showed it. You could read a geoduck the way a geologist read a core sample, if you knew what to look for and had enough seasons of comparison. Ida Conley was 66 years old. She had been reading Geoduck for 34 years. She ran the family shellfish lease in the estuary, Geoduck in the subtidal zone, Dungeness crab in the channels, a small oyster operation on the intertidal flats. The lease had been established by her mother in the early 1970s, staked out by a woman who had spent 3 years diving the estuary before she committed to a specific location, who believed that the right ground was worth identifying carefully before you tied yourself to it for a generation. Her mother had been right. The ground was good. It had been good for 50 years. Not uniformly. The northern section had always been more reliable through difficult years, the southern section more productive in the good ones. The difference between them a mystery Ida had chased for 30 years without fully solving. But good. Consistently, durably, generationally good. The proof of this was in the cold storage room, in a cardboard box that held her mother's harvest records from 1974 to 2008, when her mother had stepped back. Not journals. Her mother had not been a journal keeper. What she had kept were the harvest records that the Shellfish Regulatory Program required. The species tags and weight tickets from every commercial harvest, organized by month and year, rubber-banded and boxed. They were regulatory documents, not observation documents. They had been kept to satisfy the state and the tax authority, not to build an environmental baseline. But they were 50 years of the same ground, the same species, the same measurement points, kept with the discipline of someone who understood that records were records, not data in any scientific sense, not observation in any intentional sense, just the paperwork that running a commercial shellfish operation required. Kept accurately because inaccurate records created regulatory problems, and organized because disorganized records made tax preparation impossible. Ida had continued them with the same discipline for 16 years of her own operation. She had also added something her mother hadn't kept: quarterly size measurements from the lease's southern section, average shell length to harvest, recorded specifically because she had noticed, in her 4th year of working the ground, that the southern section produced consistently larger geoduck than the northern section, and she wanted to track whether that pattern held. It was a practical question. Larger animals brought better prices and suggested better growth conditions, not a scientific one. It had held for 30 years. Until it didn't. The Navigation Channel Deepening project had been in planning for 4 years before Ida had a chance to comment formally. The project was federally approved, funded, and contracted before any community input session that she had been able to attend. By the time the Port Authority held its stakeholder meeting, the engineering design was complete and the environmental review was finalized. She attended the meeting anyway. The project's purpose was legitimate and she understood it, allowing larger container vessels to access the port without the scheduling constraints imposed by the existing channel's depth limitations. The economic arguments were real. The jobs, the expanded shipping capacity with support were real. She had read the project documentation carefully enough to know that the people who had designed it had done serious work, and she had no interest in opposing a port expansion for its own sake. She had grown up on this estuary, and she understood the relationship between the port's economics and the community's viability. The two were not separable, and she had never pretended they were. What the serious work had not included was a fine-scale analysis of what the deeper channels in large tidal prism would do to the secondary current environment in the estuary's southern arm, which was where her lease sat. She raised this at the stakeholder meeting, as precisely as she could. She said, "A deeper channel means more water moving in and out per tidal cycle. More water means stronger currents throughout the system. Stronger currents means different sediment dynamics in the secondary channels. And different sediment dynamics means the substrate in my southern lease section will change. I have 30 years of size data from that section. The substrate there has been producing larger geoduck because of a specific mix of fine sediment that settles there at a rate controlled by the current. Change the current. You change the substrate. you change the settlement and growth dynamics. The Port Authority's marine biologist, Dr. Nkosi, listened carefully. He said the project hydrodynamic modeling showed current velocity increases in the secondary channels within acceptable ranges for benthic species. He said geoduck size variation was multi-factorial: temperature, food availability, disease pressure, stock density, and that attributing size trend changes to substrate change would require sediment analysis that wasn't part of her current data. Ida asked what pre-project sediment data the environmental review had collected in the southern lease area. Dr. Nkosi said the review had focused on the primary channel and the immediate surrounding area. Secondary channel sediment in the southern arm had been extrapolated from the regional baseline. Ida said, extrapolated from a regional baseline. Won't catch what I'm seeing in the southern section. The regional sediment patterns don't explain the site-specific size difference I've been measuring for 30 years. Dr. Nkosi said her size data was valuable observational information and would be noted in the project record. Ida drove home along the Estuary road, watching the water through the passenger window. The evening light was going flat, and the channel's surface was calm, which was how it looked when you didn't know what was happening underneath it. She thought about what she had and what she didn't have. She had the size data. She had the weight tickets going back to 1974. She had 30 years of a consistent pattern in the southern section that was consistent enough to mean something. What she didn't have was the mechanism. She was a shellfish farmer, not a sedimentologist. She knew the southern section produced larger geoduck. She knew it had always produced larger geoduck. She had a theory about fine sediment and settlement conditions that she had developed from observation and inference, but she hadn't measured the sediment, hadn't characterized the substrate difference beyond what her feet told her when she worked the bottom, hadn't captured the current data that would have shown what the southern section's environment was actually doing. She had 30 years of result. She didn't have 30 years of explanation. She thought about this for a while. She thought about whether she had missed something, whether there was an obvious test she should have run years ago that would have closed the gap between what she knew and what she could demonstrate. She thought about the regional warming event that had been stressing Pacific shellfish populations for several years, a documented phenomenon that affected geoduck growth across the coast, and that she had been following in the fisheries press with the attention of someone whose livelihood depended on water temperature. She pulled her size data and looked at the trend carefully, sorting the southern section numbers against the northern section numbers year by year. If the warming trend was the primary driver of the southern section's decline, both sections should show similar patterns. Same water, same warming. The northern section should be declining too, at roughly the same rate, for the same reason. The northern section was declining, but less steeply and starting later. The southern section's decline had begun 2 years before the northern section's warming-related stress was measurable in the data. The warming trend was real and was affecting her lease, but it wasn't the primary cause of what was happening in the south. The southern section's problems had started earlier and were continuing at a rate the warming trend alone didn't explain. She filed this as confirmed and went back to the problem of how to close the explanation gap. The dredging began in spring and ran through the summer. By autumn, the deeper channel was navigable. The first post-Panamax vessel transited the port in October, which the local paper covered with photographs. Ida pulled her first post-project quarterly from the southern section in November. She had been looking forward to this data in the specific way that you looked forward to something you were afraid of, wanting to know, not wanting to know, unable to stop the knowing from arriving. The size data was down. Not catastrophically. 4% below her pre-project 3-year average, which was within the range of natural variation if you took any single quarter in isolation. But it followed 2 years of pre-project decline and a 3-year trend that she had been watching since before the project broke ground. 4% in isolation meant nothing. 4% as a continuation of a trend meant something she would need to keep watching. She ran her trap pulls from the crab grounds and noted that the bottom felt different in the southern lease area, harder underfoot in places where it had always been soft, the fine material that had always characterized the southern section apparently absent in patches where she had felt it for 30 years. She was not certain of this. The feel of bottom sediment through a diver's boot was not a measurement. She had not taken sediment cores. She had not run acoustic surveys. She had not collected water samples to characterize the current. What she had was a comparison between what the bottom felt like under her boots today and what it felt like for 34 years prior, which was a kind of comparison that a scientist would not accept as evidence, but that a shellfish farmer with 3 decades on a specific bottom could not simply dismiss. She had been diving this ground for 34 years. She had learned to trust what the bottom told her. She submitted the size data to the Port Authority's post-project monitoring program and filed a formal observation noting the bottom texture change. She received an acknowledgement. The sediment survey came 18 months later, commissioned after Ida's second formal complaint and a request from the state's Shellfish Management Office, which had been tracking her size data submissions with interest. The survey team was from the university's marine geology department, and they spent a week in the southern lease area deploying sediment samplers and acoustic backscatter equipment that could characterize substrate composition across the lease without Ida having to dive every point. She dove with them on the first 2 days anyway, showing them where the bottom felt different, pointing to the patches where the fine material was absent in ways that hadn't been true before. The senior sedimentologist watched her work without comment, but she was paying close attention to where Ida went and what she was pointing at before she placed her own samplers. The survey found what Ida had felt with her feet. Measurable coarsening in the southern section substrate across the primary harvest area, consistent with finer particles having been winnowed out by increased current energy and replaced by a coarser mix. Geoduck larvae preferred the finer substrate for settlement. Juveniles grew better in the finer mix, which retained more organic material and offered better thermal buffering. The southern section had been producing larger animals because the current dynamics had maintained the right sediment mix for 40 years. The channel deepening had changed the current dynamics. The sediment survey team asked for historical baseline data to document what the substrate had been like before the project. Ida handed them the cardboard box. The senior sedimentologist spent 2 days with the box. She went through the weight tickets and species tags in chronological order, cross-referencing the harvest data against the sediment core samples the team had taken at different points in the southern section. She was constructing a timeline, when the sediment had been one thing and when it had changed, and whether the change corresponded to the channel deepening. She came to Ida at the end of the second day. She said, "Your mother's records go back to 1974. The size data you've been adding since 1990 is continuous. This is one of the most complete multi-decade productivity records I've ever worked with for an individual shellfish lease." Ida said, "My mother kept them because she had to. The shellfish program required harvest reporting, and she was too careful a person to keep bad records. I kept them because she did, and because the practice had been established." The sedimentologist said, "Nobody kept them as an environmental baseline. Nobody needed to. The requirements that made your mother keep accurate harvest records also created an inadvertent environmental record, a record of what this ground was producing at what scale across decades that no formal monitoring program had captured. The data was always there. It just needed the right question to become useful." She said, "The right question turned out to be, what was this ground doing before someone changed the channel?" She said the timeline was clear. The southern section had maintained a consistent size advantage for 30 years before the project. The advantage had been eroding for 2 pre-project years during which preliminary site work and survey operations had already been affecting the local current environment, and the decline had accelerated post-project in a way that was consistent with the sediment coarsening the survey had measured. She said, "Your mother's weight tickets are the baseline. Without them, we couldn't have made this finding." The findings went to Port Authority and to the Army Corps of Engineers, which had federal oversight of the navigation project. The Port Authority's response was careful. The project had been completed, the economic benefits were real, and the channel could not be undeepened. But the findings were documented. A compensatory habitat restoration program was established for the southern lease area, funded from the Port Authority's environmental mitigation budget, focusing on substrate enhancement, adding fine material to the coarsened sections to restore something closer to the original sediment mix. It was not a complete solution. Substrate enhancement was an imprecise intervention, and the enhanced areas would need ongoing maintenance as the current continued to winnow the finer material away. But it was a response. The size data in the southern section stabilized in the second year after the enhancement work began. Not recovered. Stabilized. The decline stopped. The animals she was pulling were no larger than they had been the previous year. But they were no smaller either, and the previous 2 years had shown consistent decline. Stability, in that context, was a form of progress. The gap between northern and southern sections narrowed slightly. It was too early to call it recovery. It was enough to call it beginning, and in 34 years of working this ground, she had learned that beginnings were worth more than they looked while they were still too small to see clearly. Ida was at the lease on a November morning, doing her quarterly dive in the southern section, when she understood for the first time what her mother's records were actually for. She had been thinking about the sedimentologist's phrase, inadvertent environmental record, and what it meant about the relationship between keeping records and knowing why you kept them. Her mother had known exactly why she kept those records, because the shellfish program required it and the tax authority required it, and because she was a careful person who kept what was required. She had not known, and could not have known, that the requirements would create something useful for a question nobody had thought to ask yet. Not for the tax authority, not for the shellfish regulator. Those had been the stated reasons, the practical demands that had created the habit. But the habit, maintained for 50 years and then 16 more, had done something else entirely. It had created the only record that existed of what this ground had been producing before anyone changed the channel. Her mother had kept those tickets because she had to. Ida had kept them because her mother had kept them, and because it was the right practice, and because 34 years into an operation, you didn't change the practices that had held the operation together. Neither of them had kept them in order to have something to show a sedimentologist 30 years later. The ground had been good. The records proved it had been good. The records proved when it stopped being as good, and by how much and in which section. The records were the memory of the lease, and the memory was the only thing that made the intervention possible. She surfaced and made her notes at the dive float, the way she had made notes at the end of every dive for 34 years. Size measurements, location, depth, bottom texture observations. The water was cold, and the estuary was doing what it had always done. She would add them to the spreadsheet that night. She would rubber band the paper copies by month and put them in a box with her mother's, in the same cold storage room, in the same sequence. The box was getting full. She would need another one soon. Her mother's box had lasted 34 years. She supposed hers would last as long as whoever came after her needed it to. Someone would want them someday. She didn't know for what. She had spent 34 years keeping records and had never imagined that the reason would be a channel deepening and a sediment survey. She had not imagined it because she had not imagined the channel deepening either. She had imagined other things, other pressures, other changes that would come to this estuary over the years. The specific reason didn't matter. The habit did. She had learned that you didn't need to know for what. You just kept the record, the way her mother had kept the record, and trusted that the ground would eventually give you a reason to have it. She started the engine and headed back to the dock. The estuary was calm around her, the channel markers straight, the water doing what it had always done, moving sediment, cycling nutrients, maintaining conditions that made a lease here worth working. Not perfectly, not the way it had before the channel deepening, but well enough. The estuary moved around her, doing what estuaries did, processing water, moving sediment, cycling nutrients, doing the slow biological work that had been going on in this channel since long, before anyone had thought to stake a lease in it or cut a shipping channel through it. The ground was a ground. The record was a record. And somewhere in that cardboard box, 50 years of her mother's careful accounting were waiting for whatever question came next.